I'd like to invite on stage a tech entrepreneur that is going to answer a very, very tough question. Will tech kill democracy? Tobias Stone, please take the stage.
Good afternoon. So my talk ties in with this morning's talk with Chris Wiley, and it was an amazing achievement of Bogdan to get Chris to come and speak today. So like a lot of you, I'm a tech guy. I was running an accelerator in Berlin and working with startups. And then in 2016, I started getting a bit pissed off with what was going on. So Donald Trump was running for president. The Brexit campaign was starting in my country. And I kind of decided to write about it. And I wrote an article and put it on Medium, which was still quite new then. And I was arguing in the article that you can look back over history and see what happens. You look back at the First World War and the Second World War, and it seems to be happening again, but no one's learning. And it was a long piece, but some of the ideas I had included that people generally don't look very far into the past, and they don't look very far beyond where they're standing. So it's hard to see how things connect together. And the article was quite well received. Quite a lot of people read it. It was quite exciting, I think, when 1,000 people had viewed it, and then 10,000 people viewed it. But then this happened. And shortly afterwards, people like Ricky Gervais started writing about my article. And he put this up on his Facebook, and it got shared 42,000 times. And the stats on my Medium article started going a bit crazy. And you can see there when it got to 3.6 million. And obviously, it was quite exciting. I remember being out at dinner when I got to 1 million views and being a little bit shocked. In fact, by the end, the article got viewed about 21 million times globally. On Medium, it's still, I think, the most read article ever, with 7.6 million, got 5.5 million views or more on Huffington Post. I actually started getting emails from people who'd found it and decided it was so important to what was happening in their country that they translated it for me. And I know it got translated into Czech, French, Japanese, Danish, Spanish, and probably more. It got translated into Czech twice. And so I became a writer. And in order to do all this writing, I had to start reading a lot as well. And so most of what I've been doing over the last few years is reading news, reading articles, reading other people's work. And I started trying to trace a line through what's happening and also how tech, the world that we understand, fits into all of this. In March 2017, I wrote an article about Donald Trump. I was sort of amazed at how much he was lying. I mean, we all know politicians lie quite a lot, but this was on a whole new scale. And as you can see from the picture, I looked back in history again at how governments and political leaders use lies and realized that what was happening with Trump and also with Russia is that if you tell enough lies about something, the truth gets buried. If you put out 10 or 12 different versions of what happened, only one of them is true, and it gets much harder to see what it was. And in fact, I was lucky to meet Gary Kasparov at TechCrunch Disrupt New York that year, and a tweet he put up I quote a lot. The point about modern propaganda is not to misinform or push an agenda, it's to exhaust your ability to think about things, to destroy truth. And in fact, it became clear when I was looking at it more that we weren't meant to believe the fake news. These lies are not meant to be true or convincing. They're just meant to confuse us so much we don't actually know what's happening. While I was doing all this, I started looking around in some of the pro-Trump Facebook groups. I wanted to see what was being discussed. And this one caught my attention. A guy called Fiznik Taki wrote that Denzel Washington said that Trump should go to prison for 15 years. Obama should go to prison for 15 years. And I thought, really? That's a bit strange. So I clicked on alwaysnews.us and started finding myself in a whole new world. What was amazing is that the Americans reading this were loving it, were sharing it, were commenting on it. And I started finding more and more of these strange Facebook groups that were very pro-Trump. They were putting up things that were clearly not true. When you clicked on that, it went to a website that had a kind of article about Denzel Washington, but it was clearly just stuck together. It didn't really mean anything at all. So I wrote an article about it. And it took me about 10 or 15 minutes to realize that all of this news was coming out of Macedonia and Kosovo. This became quite famous eventually. If you clicked on Boycott Liberal Media, which had 14,000 members, there were some other fantastic ones, it was clear that a lot of the owners of the groups and a lot of the memes being generated were coming out of people with obviously Kosovo names and Macedonian names. And Medium then asked me to commission me to write a longer article about this, which became The Truth About Fake News. And BBC picks up on this, and some of you may have read about Velez in Macedonia. And there were kids in Macedonia who realized they could basically play the system. You've got Facebook, you've got the advertisers on Facebook, and they found that if they wrote articles that were anti-Trump, anti-Clinton rather, Trump followers got really excited and clicked on everything. They found that Clinton followers were less likely to click on stuff, so they became pro-Trump. They had no political agenda. They didn't really care what was happening in America. And they started making very, very good money. It was obvious when you looked very, very quickly that a lot of the new stuff, a lot of the crazy stuff was coming out of new members. And the new members' profiles were clearly fake. Again, it took minutes to discover this. This one was particularly good. Beard guy, who was running a God Bless America pro-Trump Facebook group. And if you searched his photograph, he was a beard model. The other thing I found a lot, Trump God's Choice. If you want to see what insanity looks like, go to Trump God's Choice on Facebook. And this was a weird mix of profiles that only had photographs of kittens, creating wildly anti-Clinton memes that lots and lots of right-wing Christian Americans were then liking and sharing. This was one of them. But it got really quite serious. They were sharing very anti-Clinton messages. Hundreds of people were liking them, were sharing them, and it was really quite out of control. And what interested me is that you had some quite clever entrepreneurs in Macedonia playing the system, and why shouldn't they? Affecting thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people in America, and actually affecting how they voted. And there was a huge disconnect between what was going on. BuzzFeed actually looked at this. They found that during the American election, fake stories got shared more than non-fake stories. And if you think about it, if you sit down and want to make up a story that's more likely to get shared, it's easy to do it if you don't have to stick to the truth, because the truth is usually quite boring. And I asked in my article, if Facebook knows who I am, where I am, who I know, what I like, what I want to see, why can't they figure out that a group with 45,000 people is being moderated by a fake profile out of Macedonia and generally posted by Facebook profiles consisting of kittens? And of course, it got quite serious. I don't know how many of you heard about Pizzagate. So Pizzagate was a fake meme that suggested that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile gang in a cellar under a pizza restaurant. We don't know whether this one came from Russia or came from Macedonia or came from the alt-right, but it ended up with a guy running around to this pizza restaurant with a gun to rescue the children. And that's him getting arrested. So these fake memes and fake stories began to blur into reality, and of course, the biggest reality was that Trump won the election. This led me to write a series of pieces called The Great Cyber War, and I tried, and it was very long, to connect together everything I'd been seeing happening. So I lived in Estonia for 10 years, and I was there when Russia first cyber attacked Estonia in 2007, so I'm much more aware of what's been happening with information warfare and cyber attacks. And what I argued in The Great Cyber War was that we're actually in the middle of a huge war. And if this was a conventional war, we're at the stage where our houses would have been bombed and our friends would have been killed already. But because it's a hybrid cyber war, most people don't know it's happening. And I started off with Estonia in 2007. So back in 2007, there was a bronze soldier statue of a Russian soldier. And the Estonian government decided to move it to a military cemetery from the center of town because the Russian soldier being memorialized had invaded Estonia. And they didn't do it very well, and there were huge riots. And I remember, because I was there, that my Russian friends were all receiving text messages telling them to go and riot. And at the time, I said to them, where are the text messages coming from? They were like, I don't know. But everyone was getting them. Of course, now we'd look back and it all makes much more sense. Also, there were youth NGOs that started having huge protests outside the Estonian embassy in Moscow and attacked the Estonian ambassador. And most of all, there was a huge cyber attack. And if you look it up in the now history books, basically the guy who had predicted cyber attacks might happen one day, because they'd never really happened before, turned the internet off in the middle of the night to stop this vast attack on the Estonian banks, government institutions. Then in 2008, Georgia, I don't know if you even remember that, Russia did it again. This time there were cyber attacks, but there was an actual military attack. And preempting something we were going to see later on, Russia denied there was a military attack. They said that the soldiers were volunteers, that they were peacekeepers, and told what we now would look at as just being, going back to my previous points, barefaced lies, but enough lies that it became very hard to understand what was really going on. And all of this then came together in 2014 with Ukraine, where you saw this whole mixture of hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, information warfare, deniable soldiers, all coming together. And people forget that Ukraine started as an information war. Igor Strelkov, who was sent into Donetsk to start this war, actually said later when he fell out with Putin that people in Donetsk didn't want to fight. There wasn't any interest, and they had to have huge information warfare. There was the meme of a fake story of a Russian child that was crucified by Ukrainians that went out on the news and was broadcast on Russian news and was completely untrue. That information war became a cyber war. There have been huge cyber attacks in Ukraine, including taking out power for 250,000 people. And if you remember, there was also a passenger airline shot down over Ukraine. But there was so much confusing information that all of us were busy arguing about whether the soldiers in Crimea and eastern Ukraine were soldiers, or were they just Russian soldiers on holiday, who'd shot down the airplane, whether the CIA had been behind the protests in Kiev. And in fact, what was happening was very simple. Russia had invaded eastern Ukraine, seized Crimea, and shot down a passenger plane. And since then, Putin has admitted that, and all the evidence has shown who shot down the plane. But we were so confused by all this information that we got caught up in having lots of discussions about it and got lost in the information warfare. And then Brexit. It's becoming very, very clear now, if you read the news about Brexit, that, as we saw this morning, Cambridge Analytica was heavily involved. Russia was heavily involved. The Internet Research Agency, which is a part of the Russian government working in St. Petersburg, was tweeting hugely about Leave just before the vote. In fact, the University of London have done a study and discovered that 13,500 Twitter bots were promoting Brexit, and almost all of them disappeared suddenly afterwards. They either changed their names or got decommissioned. And a lot of the URLs that the Twitter bots were pointing at disappeared as well. So this was not individuals messing around with Twitter. This was a coordinated campaign. Wired actually then pointed out that the Twitter accounts that were used to push the American election of Trump were also used to promote Brexit. So this was clearly a large machinery being pointed in different directions and coordinated. News started coming out about the Internet Research Agency on Shevchenko Street in St. Petersburg, which has a huge budget, a large number of people, just doing information warfare. And as has happened now with the FBI investigation, some of the arrests or the arrest warrants, it's quite clear that this was part of the campaign to affect the election in America. Heart of Texas was a very good example. Was at one point, there was a campaign for Texas to become independent of the United States. And the most popular Facebook page for Heart of Texas, with 250,000 followers, was actually run by the Russian government. And at one point, they managed to get two separate groups of people to go out and protest against each other, both influenced by Russian pages that were telling them what to do. There was actually a story that on the birthday of the guy who ran this Internet Research Agency, one of the Russian-controlled Facebook pages persuaded an American to go and stand outside the White House with a sign saying, "Happy birthday, boss," for the birthday of the guy running it in Russia. So there's an academic called Jonathan Albright, who, if you're interested in this, you should look up, who analyzes social networks and did some amazing work analyzing the right-wing social media network and also analyzing what Russia had been doing with America. And he found out that posts on just 6 Facebook sites that were fake reached 340 million people. And what's been happening, which I learned a bit about also when I heard Hillary Clinton speak in London about this, the posts are not trying to change people's opinion. They're not trying to get someone to go from voting Clinton to voting Trump. They're trying to stop one group of people from voting and encourage another group of people to vote. If you get people very angry, and this is Trump's base, they turn out to vote in large numbers. One of the things Hillary Clinton now thinks happened with her, she's found a lot of the fake news and the propaganda was aimed at white middle-class women who were most likely to vote for Hillary Clinton. And the aim was not to get them to vote for Trump. The aim was to get them to have enough doubt about Hillary Clinton that they wouldn't vote at all. So this is about voter suppression. And once you persuade people not to vote, the whole democratic machine breaks. When the social media companies were summoned before the Senate, Senator Dianne Feinstein tried to get it across to them that this is actually cyber warfare, this is information warfare. after the Senate hearings, Facebook began to pay more attention to this, and they admitted that 270 million accounts are fake. Just $100,000 of advertising had reached 126 million people. Twitter also admitted that 36,000 of their bots were Russian and were also fake, and they pumped out messages viewed by 288 million people. And you have to remember that the population of America is just 323 million people. So this is fake media with tiny budgets reaching up to 2/3 or more of the American population, which is probably all of the American population who are using social media. So we reached 2018. And if you look at what's happening and connect it all together, Britain is now totally divided over Brexit. It's astonishing. The United States is divided. Europe's divided. We have Poland and Hungary turning away from democracy, turning away from Europe. The UK and the European Union are arguing with each other. Italy is now arguing with the European Union. The refugee crisis, which then created a lot of fake news and social media, for example, affecting Hungary, has changed all the ideals and threatened a lot of the sort of fundamentals of European ideals. And when you look at it, it's actually very hard to know what's real. How much of what you have been reading and what other people have been reading came from kids in Kosovo or Macedonia, or came from some teenagers working for the FSB in St. Petersburg? How much of it was actually spread by Cambridge Analytica? How much of your data was stolen in the Facebook hack? How much of anything is real? And it's carrying on. Just this year, we've had Pakistani social media people being murdered. We've had Russia now finding more and more attacks on their democracy. The Rohingya crisis in Myanmar was very much affected by WhatsApp groups and social media, which actually led to people being murdered. So the question I've been asked to look at, will tech kill democracy? There's a lot we can do as a tech community. So a lot of you are building stuff now. We have to be careful what we read, and we have to be careful what we share. We should check sources, and I think really stick to only reading very, very reputable media. I barely read anything now that isn't pure mainstream. And be suspicious of everything. And in particular, almost anything in Europe over the last couple of years that involved division, the breaking of treaties, the breaking of unions, is probably coming from the alt-right and Russia. If we build tech, we have to be careful that we're not going to build stuff that gets abused. So it was interesting that Chris Wiley pointed out this morning that the internet was originally built by the military. All the idealists in Silicon Valley who were building Facebook, Twitter, and Google and meant for it to be a great tool for good have found themselves landed with huge problems. So we can at least learn from that now, and when we're building things, we can try and work out how they could be abused. The other thing I think is very important is building cyber safety and cyber security into technology. Even if your app isn't obviously cyber, even if it's not fintech or security, if it's a pizza delivery app, it should still be safe, it should still be secure. And think about privacy. Don't let your tech be the one that's the next problem. So you can read some of what I wrote on my Medium page if you haven't done. And I'm finishing 30 seconds early for any questions. Are there any questions or comments? Yes.
1 second to get the mic right there.
Okay, so we are aware for a long time of this kind of manipulation. Do you see any potential solution on the horizon? Because if it goes like this in a few years, you can't read anything on internet anymore.
I think if there is a solution, some of it was discussed this morning. I think the big tech companies will be regulated. It doesn't make sense that something like Facebook has become the way we communicate with each other, and yet it's totally unregulated and there's no competitor. So even if we wanted to, we can't really stop using it. So I think in the end there will be some form of regulation. And I liked what Chris Wiley said this morning. If you build a bridge as an engineer, it's full of rules and regulations so people don't die when the bridge collapses. And I think the engineering infrastructure of the internet will have to start getting regulated like that. I think we're learning. I think the big tech companies realize they've got a problem, but they're probably too big to move quickly and react quickly. So I think I'm not very positive. I think we're a bit too trapped inside the technology, and I think also the problem is, let's call them the bad guys who want to do this, have huge budgets. So one of the problems we have in the West, in democracies, is the electoral cycle means that governments look at what happens every 5 years. Countries like China and Russia don't have that problem. They can plan 10, 15 years ahead and get around it. Any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk.